I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. I'm speaking this week with Stephen Searcy, the author of the poetry collection Below the Brightness from Solem Literary Press, and more immediately, the author of Limiting Poetry's Feedback Loop, a provocative essay published in New Verse Review that got some people inspired some strong feelings, including from some SLEERICKETS listeners. So I spoke to Stephen, and we really just sort of dug into this essay and all of the questions that it invites. It was really like exactly the kind of conversation I like having on the show. It was, I think, some good-natured disagreement, some agreement, some consensus finding, some consensus breaking, and a lot of questions that did not have absolute answers. Yeah, I think, we talked about what is the problem with self-referential poetry. What are the different kinds of self-referential poetry? Whether self-referential poetry actually has the effect Stephen says it has. What he would like positively to see in poetry rather than simply what he would not like to see. And the nature of, polemics and provocative essays writ large. Whether you agreed with Stephen's essay, disagreed with it, or have not yet read it, I think you'll find a lot to enjoy. So here is my conversation with Stephen Searcy, author of Below the Brightness from Solem Literary Press, and if you have not yet read Limiting Poetry's Feedback Loop at New Verse Review, go check it out just after we have this conversation. First, though, friend of the show and editor at New Verse Review, I can't remember which variety of editor she is, but she does a lot of things over there, Zena Gomez-Liss, she had a prize invented on her behalf by J. Tullius at Verdurous Glooms, who held a triolet contest, and Zena submitted a triolet crown. Her poem was called A Crown for the Kings, and Tullius liked it so much that J. Tullius, I don't know who J. Tullius is. One Man Learning to Die. Verdurous Glooms. I confess also Verdurous Glooms strikes me as a title of a man's Substack. Maybe that's sexist. But Zena sent in a triolet crown, and he invented a new prize for her. He was so excited by her poems. So I'll include a link in the show notes to that. So congrats to Zena and well chosen J. Tullius. I also wanted to say a word about just a nice piece of news I learned of only the other day when it came out. I think he's a Brit. Yeah. Jeremy Wakely, a critic, poet, wrote a review of my book. I did not know this was happening. It originally ran in the Little Review, the Tristram Fane Saunders book, which for all of you nepotism watchers, I can't say that had nothing to do. I mean, who knows? But I would imagine that had something to do with it. I will also say that I had a conversation with Alice that's going to, I think, as I mentioned, come out eventually in print form in Poetry London, in which she asked if there were any good sources for honest discussion of poetry, and I listed the Little Review. To confirm, I did say that before I learned about they had run a review of my book, but I would have given the same answer if I had, if it had been after. So, nepotism is alive and well. But I don't know Jeremy Wakely, and I was very pleased to see that he'd done a review. I don't know what it says, but I think it's nice. Or at least if I sent him a note saying thank you for this review, I'm very scared of reading them, but I appreciate you writing it. And he didn't respond with "you fool." Didn't you see that I slaughtered your book. All right, so let's get to my conversation with Stephen Searcy about limiting poetry's feedback loop. So you have this essay that has made a splash, and I confess, like my self-centered response initially was that I saw it and I thought like, hey, good for Stephen. Shit, all right. Because we'd corresponded a little bit, and I I felt not like possessive of you, but I felt like I was in the loop with you, because you were a listener and you'd written in and you disagreed with plenty of things I'd said in the past, but you'd like so I was excited to see this thing make some noise.
Made a little more noise than I expected. I mean, I knew it was provocative, but there's been a lot of response on both sides of it. So
yeah, I mean, which is I think the best kind of response. I mean, if any, just in terms of the comment section, the pastor piece was seemed to be almost all just endorsement, and so I feel like if nothing else, I was offering a public service by
Hmm.
providing some disagreement. But
Yeah.
this, I mean, this is something that New Verse Review does. It's maybe my favorite thing they do,
Hmm.
which is
Oh, and I
periodic.
definitely felt encouraged to send it to them and felt like they would probably
Yeah,
want to publish something like that because of the
yeah, yeah,
other,
yeah.
Elijah's essays and things like that that they've already
Yeah.
done. So,
No, no, totally. And they like to put out, they call them provocations, whether they're manifestos or I think Steve called this a polemic.
hmm.
Whatever they are, they're strong opinions that are not broadly agreeable about
Hmm.
poetry
Yeah.
today. And I mean, I think it's terrific. My challenge to them is like I kind of want them to put out something that is as forceful as what you wrote, but against the grain of their readership. I think it would be
Yeah.
interesting. I mean, it'd be hard.
Yeah.
It'd be harder to get to solicit that. It'd be harder to get that. But like, I
Hmm.
would love to see a little more crossfire, just because I think it's always good for the conversation.
Yeah.
Um,
There was more strong agreement than I expected. Like I
oh
expected
yeah,
some
people
of
really.
both,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
there
yeah.
was a lot of strong agreement. And I do think that is because of the audience of Nuverse Review is going to be more favorable towards some of the things I was saying,
Yeah,
quoting.
yeah, yeah. Well, so for people who might not be familiar with it, do you want to? This is called limiting poetry's feedback loop, and I know the way titles and subtitles work. It's often not the author. Was that your title, or was that?
The title was mine actually. Steve Nepper came up with the subtitle, which I
Okay,
didn't
which is the
I
other
didn't get
question.
involved.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
subtitle is on writing poems for people in the real world, which is in a
yep.
way it's sort of a
But
secondary
he
provocation
Yeah,
itself.
he
Yeah.
he did run it by me, and that's not what I would have come up with, but I did the thing that I did like about it was that it was kind of giving the positive side of what I was trying to argue, not just the negative side.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like it's most of your essay is against things, but
Yeah,
that's the suggestion that it could also be
yeah.
for something.
And it
Um,
is in the end I tried to make some more positive suggestions about what to do instead, but that was yeah, that wasn't my original. I didn't give a subtitle to it originally.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, those things I always know they can change during
Hmm.
during the editing. But yeah, so limiting poetry's feedback loop is the title. Would you give a short summary of kind of the basic argument, and then we can get into the details?
Yeah, I mean the basic argument is is actually so simple. I think that it's could led to some misunderstanding or confusion about what it
Sure.
was really about because I, tried to give examples and illustrations and talk about different things, but really it's just that it's actually more specific than a lot of critiques of contemporary poetry that you'll find with like some of the other ones I cited, like Dana Gioia's Can Poetry Matter or Wendell Berry's The Specialization of Poetry are, kind of talking about a lot of different aspects of contemporary poetry and
Yeah,
why
yeah,
it is in, low esteem and why people don't engage with it anymore. But there's just sort of one really sub piece of that tended has I've realized over the last little while has uh, recognized that it kind of bothers me and I feel like it's a negative thing in general for poetry as an art form, which is that there's just a lot of poems that are explicitly mention the fact that a poet is writing it or the
yeah,
poet's life, the poet's work, the schools and the workshops and the act of writing is part of the poetry itself. It's like part of the content of the poetry, not just something that undergirds it, but is actually showing up in the poem. The thing I've asked myself a lot since is how much of this is my subjective preference, but to me
sure.
it seemed almost too obvious that this is very alienating to anyone who's not already part of that world. Not that they wouldn't like it, but just that it might feel kind of confusing or why are you saying this or why should I care about this if it's too much about talking about poetic terms or talking about the experience of writing poetry and what it feels like to write a poem. Someone who's never written a poem is not going to resonate with that.
Yeah,
And poets will and poets do, but the problem is because the audience of poetry is poets and critics and the obsessive readers and not most normal people. Unfortunately, it's another stumbling block of giving people a way in to find poets they like and ways that they might actually become interested in poetry. So that was the idea, just to say that the poet is fixated on poetry and thinks about it a lot, and so it's just natural for that to become part of what they're writing about,
Yeah.
and that it's because a lot of other poets are reading your poems, you may get positive responses to that, feedback on that, get that published and get it, enjoyed by other poets or other people who like poetry a lot. But for people who aren't, it's kind of excluding and limiting the scope of who poetry can speak to and who it can reach.
In a way, you're offering one answer and a partial answer to a kind of an implied question, which is, most people who read poetry today are poets, like
Hmm.
overwhelmingly,
Yeah.
overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
Almost all poetry readers are poets. The number of people who read poems and don't write them. I feel like every time I meet somebody like that,
Yeah.
it's like meeting a unicorn. If you're like, whoa,
Yeah.
holy shit, how did that happen?
Hmm.
Especially if they write criticism. And even
Yeah.
like Victoria Mull, who's brilliant and it was a total delight to talk to. I confess, when she's a critic, she loves poetry, she does translations
Hmm.
and criticism. But then when she told me that she also had started writing poems, my heart sank a little. I was like, no, no, not you too. They got to you.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I think there is something, there is an there seems to be a problem there, and there are a lot of potential answers to that. Like, well, why is that the case?
Hmm.
One
Yeah.
answer is, and Joya talks about this among other people, that poets write in a way that is too esoteric or is too
Hmm.
specialized. I think I haven't read the Windleberry essay, but I could make an educated guess about the argument of it.
Hmm.
I mean, almost 20 years ago, I wrote a big essay about, I think part of and I think it's less the case now, but at the time, I thought a lot of poems, like a lot of academic and mainstream poems, were basically just didn't make sense. Like, were
Hmm.
not legible to a casual reader.
Hmm.
And so your partial response is like, well, maybe part of the reason is that so much of it is inside baseball. It's
That's
about stuff that we
yeah.
are invested in.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the for sure it maybe is the biggest stumbling block what you just said about that it's esoteric, that it's not accessible and people just have no clue. I feel like most people who don't read it would just say, I don't understand it,
Yeah,
is
yeah,
their
yeah.
number one reason for giving it.
Right.
But then you have, and I feel like probably the most frequent disagreement response was about how much had a few Billy Collins poetry poems included there in the examples I gave.
Yeah.
But that's a poet who is actually very accessible, very easy to read. It's
Yeah.
not confusing, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but I feel like he also is doing this thing. It's kind of his thing, so it's not he's figured out a way to do that, and it's interesting to some extent, but it's also I feel like it's too specific to poetry related stuff, that you still have that kind of, if you're not already interested in writing and interested in poetry, is that going to really be interesting? That's
Yeah.
that's my feeling.
I mean, yeah, and that is because a lot of your links were to Billy Collins poems, and it's funny because I had so many like a multi-directional response to this essay. I really enjoyed it, and I just had a lot of thoughts all around it. We were initially going to try to have this conversation with Katie Dozier, and the scheduling
Hmm.
didn't work, but she had some responses in the comments, and we've corresponded a little. But a point she made that I had not thought about, but I think is sort of striking, is that it's not just that Billy Collins is a very popular poet. It's not just, as she says, that he tends to reach non-poets, but it's even, I would go further to say, the more one is an insider in the poetry world, the less likely one is to like Billy Collins. I know there are serious poets who like him, but I think
Hmm.
it is, I mean, certainly when I was in college, like, it was very fashionable in the poetry scene to make fun of Billy Collins.
Hmm.
That in
Yeah.
a way, like, he's most popular outside among non-poets, and least popular with poets.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. and
which is,
and
but it's also baffling because I think, like, all of those kind of corny poems about writing workshops, I have the same feeling you do, which is like, come on, man, what are we doing here?
I mean, they often can be, they're funny and they're
Yeah,
interesting
yeah,
if
yeah,
you're familiar with that topic. But if you don't know what a writing workshop is, then that's
yeah,
going to
yeah,
be
yeah,
really hard to
yeah.
understand. Now the thing that's interesting to me is that Billy Collins' name is famous, but in terms of if we really want to say who do non-poets read and know about, I would not think it's Billy Collins. I would think that he's sort of like people who are kind of interested in poetry or into a certain style of poetry, like Billy Collins. So there are other people who are, don't like him
Mhm.
as much, but I feel like people who really are not into poetry at all are going totally elsewhere for
Yeah,
that kind
I
of
think you mentioned Mary Oliver, who I think is certainly, is a big name. Or maybe
yeah.
was it you or somebody else who
No,
mentioned?
I
Yeah,
did in one of the responses, but and also someone else in the comment gave a response that she said the number one person that my non-poet friends read is Jewel, and
I mean, yeah,
then an
yeah,
Instagram poet,
right.
and
Instagram
then
poets,
maybe
yeah,
Mary Oliver if someone was
right.
had an artsy major in college. So
Yeah.
that's and Mary Oliver is the maybe the I felt like probably the most widely known and popular poet who has some level of credibility as a within the sort of literary world, and that's
Yeah.
also kind of she likes to get there. People like to beat up on her too, but just like
Yeah,
Billy Collins because
yeah.
they're popular. I mean, I think that's part of why.
No, I mean, yeah, certainly it's yeah, I wonder with like if Billy Collins had never become really famous, but had been sort of like had remained poetry famous, I wonder
Hmm.
if, I mean, setting aside the whole Rankin controversy, I wonder if people would think of him a little more the way they think of like Tony Hoagland, who
Mm.
in some respects is not so different from Billy Collins. I think he's a little more self-aware and he's got a slightly, I mean, he's maybe got a little more edge, but yeah, like part of what makes him corny is that so many people like him.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody wants to like is invested in having like a fight over defending or attacking Billy Collins.
And like I said this in the piece because I really didn't didn't want to make any claims that were super strong, and I don't think I actually did. I just brought up a lot of topics that people have strong opinions about,
Well,
but
you also
none of
offered
well,
guidelines, which
that's
people
true.
then turned
Oh,
into
it's just
rules,
yeah,
which
we
and so
we can
that's the real that's the
we can
sharpest
get to that.
provocation. Yeah.
But when I gave these examples and talked about it, I was very specifically saying I don't think any of these individual poems are necessarily bad. The problem to me is the fact that I can list out so many poems that all talk about writing poetry and poetry workshops and poetry anthologies and all these things that um, I feel like those should be more rare and hard to find, but it's easy to find that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, but you also, I think like you had a great opening sentence that also I think heavily colors everything that follows it. So the opening
Yes.
sentence is an insidious tendency permeates contemporary poetry. And I confess, in the back of my head, the echo I heard was a specter is haunting Europe, which is of course the first sentence of the Communist Manifesto. So I was like, all right, these are fighting words. Okay, like,
Wow, I'm
and then you go
honored.
on to list like, and in fairness to you, like you are in the sentences that follow, you are mostly saying like, here are some examples of common kinds of poems that, but like
Hmm.
having set it up with that opening sentence, I
Yeah,
think that's yeah, the
yeah,
knives are already out.
yeah. Well, and I think the fact is I'm trying to say it's a tendency. It's a
Yeah.
proclivity. It's something that's done too much. Not that the impulse itself is wrong, but just that um, I think there's not enough recognition and pushback to realize that's maybe not the most universally interesting and the best poetry that we can offer the world.
So
Is
then the question that I have, because again, like when I read an essay like this, I have very split responses, because part of me is a as a guilty self-loathing writer reads any kind of polemic and says, "Oh, I am guilty of like I am I do think I'm extraordinarily guilty of it. Like thinking back even on the chapbook I'm about to put out, it's like, oh well, like all the red flags would be going up at like almost every other poem, but based on these rules. But also like I'm a huge believer in writing in order to be approachable, accessible, and writing to
Mhm.
welcome in an audience. I don't. I mean,
Yeah.
in fact, like I'm most heartened when non-poets enjoy poems of mine. Like that to me
Hmm.
is a much truer sign of success than
Oh
a
yeah.
poet saying like,
Same.
"Oh,
Yeah,
nice, yeah, I
definitely.
thought you turned those hemisticks nicely." And you're like, "All right,
Hmm.
okay, who cares?"
Well,
Um,
something I didn't say in the piece at all, but is probably part of what I think about this, and I've kind of thought about it some more since, is that I do think that regardless of these guidelines and issues that I raised, I do think that a poem that is musical and formally excellent and robust, that really sounds wonderful and is engaging to listen to, is going can handle a subject that's maybe not as interesting as someone, they're going to be drawn into it because of that artistry that's there, as opposed to the more prosaic types of free verse that, which most of my examples are
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
free verse, and I mean the other another example that I almost had this in the piece and I took it out just because I wanted to keep it short, but the poem on first looking into Chapman's Homer
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
is
Right.
a poem that I read that when I was in high school, probably a teenager. I don't even know if it was in class or just on my own, but I I really like I loved it and I resonated
Yeah.
with it, but I didn't even know what like Chapman's Homer. I wasn't even sure what that meant.
Right.
It
Yeah, yeah,
was,
yeah.
but it didn't matter because the poem is it has this wonderful meter and rhyme and it has these rich evocative phrases, the realms of gold and watchers of the sky, and it's just it's about the thrill of discovery. It's not about reading poetry explicitly, specifically, even though that was the inspiration for him to write it, but it
Yeah.
feels like it goes bigger than that.
Because the question I think is like there's sort of there are a couple edges to it. On the one hand, you could say like, well, if you're writing about something most readers don't have experience with, then you're not going to be able to appeal to their familiarity with the subject matter.
Hmm.
But then maybe the slightly like if you take a step back, the slightly more robust criticism is even if you can write about a lot of subjects and most readers may not have experience with them, when you get a bunch of poets together and you all get into the habit of doing this over and over and over again, especially with one another's poems, it's not
Hmm.
just that you're picking a subject they're not familiar with, it's that you keep hammering down on this same subject.
Yes, exactly. And another reader made a comment that's saying, does this also mean that you object to poetry about, you know, advanced math or some other esoteric
Right,
topic
right.
like this? And I said definitely not, because to me, that's yes, it's going to limit your audience of who would care about that and who would understand that, but it's broadening the scope of who might be interested in a poem and who would want to read a poem. It's expanding the scope
Yeah.
of poetry as a whole. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be the most universal topic. That's going to be, if you really want to write the most memorable poem ever, then a
It's
more
all
universal
sex and
topic
death,
is
right?
that's what you should do.
Yeah.
But I think it's great if people want to write poems about all kinds of niche things.
Yeah, yeah.
If they can find an audience for that, that's great.
Well, I was going to say Jay Wright starts involving math complicated enough in his most recent collection that I hit a wall when I tried to read it. I was like, wait, I read a lot of poetry and people have recommended this to me, and I'm totally stymied.
Hmm.
Maybe I haven't studied enough math. So I do like. It's funny because part of me reads this as like a reminder to myself to say
Hmm.
like, hey, keep it like it's just like good to be if when you spend a lot of time writing, you know 50,000 things, but it's hard to keep them all in
Hmm.
mind at the same
Yeah.
time. And so it's nice to be reminded occasionally of something that might have slipped, out of the upper levels of consciousness. So,
Hmm.
it's nice to be reminded like, yeah, you probably don't just want to get caught in a self-referential loop. There's then then I read it as advice broadly to other writers, and then I have a slightly more complicated response because I think like, well,
Hmm.
I don't know how accurate it is as an absolute statement so much as it is useful maybe as a nudge. And
Yeah.
then if I read and then
Yeah.
if I read it as like advice that might influence how I'm reading, then I start to agree with it less because I think like, well, like it was like off the top of my head, Josie's Taekwondo made a list of like 10 great poems, all of which violate your rules.
Hmm.
And I, again, like with these kind of arguments, I'm most interested in sort of like, well, what thoughts can they provoke? What possibilities can they point to that I might not have been thinking about? Whether or not the argument as a whole is one that like, because
Hmm.
if I can just say
Yeah.
like, oh, I can poke holes in this argument, then I haven't
Yeah.
learned anything from it.
Hmm.
The fact that it might be an imperfect argument does not mean that it doesn't have something valuable to say.
Yeah. I mean, I do definitely probably the number one thing that I've thought about the most since getting all the responses is how much of this really is my own preferences and
Sure.
desires as a reader and a writer of poetry versus something that actually is objectively good for poetry as a whole. So I was definitely writing to writers and poets to think
Yeah, yeah.
about what are you writing, and then I also was sort of saying it more in a broader sense of not that each individual poet should never do this, but that as a whole art form, that I feel like it would be healthier for the art form if it wasn't so populated with this kind of work, that it would be more approachable towards more people who might be interested but are not going to have the depth of interest to go to push through something that's maybe not as interesting to them. Um, and I say that even as, you know, someone who I've written poems for a long time, but and read poems for a long time, but I didn't. There's a lot of aspects of this sort of ongoing contemporary poetry publishing and writing community that I did not become aware of or become part of until uh, more recently, last few years later in my life. And so I think that maybe is why even some of those things struck me more, because it's not been a part of my background at all to be deeply engaged with a lot of other writers.
Yeah.
That's actually been a great and enjoyable thing for me to meet more writers and get connected with more writers. But
Well, and a great way to get to make some of those connections is to throw a rock, which like unlike real
that's
rocks, it's
true.
not actually going to like
Yeah.
hurt anyone permanently,
Yeah.
and it
Well,
does, and you recognize some people who who share your impulse, who share your frustration.
yeah.
So you're like, yeah, that's the thing that's
Yeah.
been annoying me.
Well, but the other thing is that I did also make the comment to both writers and readers. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
explicitly I said that, but at the I do feel like there were enough comments that I thought, well, some people are saying I like those kind of poems. I
yeah,
agree with your general impulse to say that poetry should not only be about itself. It should be, looking towards the whole of life, but that I still enjoy Ars Poeticas and I still don't mind reading these poems about writing poems, and so I think some people just do like them more than I do, and that's
yeah, yeah.
that's really, something I have come to realize more through some of more of the comments from people afterward.
And it does seem like there's sort of split concerns in a way that they can overlap, but there's sort of the question of what makes for better poems. Then
Hmm.
there's the question of what invites people in or pushes them away.
Yes.
And like what I think of in part is one of the kind of counter provocations that New Verse Review has also published amid these manifestos is one by Alice from this podcast and Poetry Says,
Hmm.
who in her charmingly self-deprecating way sort of like, well, when I read things like this, there's a difference between saying I want more of X and saying I want less of Y. And she basically said, like, when I read essays that forcefully say I want less of Y, I always identify Y with myself and I always feel like shit afterward.
Hmm.
Which I think
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yep.
nobody wants. We don't want
Yep.
people to feel like shit.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that I really appreciated her piece saying that, because I do think that was an important thing to say, and I did I did try to couch a lot of these claims and make them not quite so strong, but it's still going to be provocative to
Yeah,
make
yeah. Well, I mean,
judgment
you're
calls
offering
and
criticism
offer opinions.
among
Yeah.
poets and people.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're all nerves. Just so people have sort of slightly more precise understanding of the essay. There's several categories that you identify as being part of this larger tendency. Um, so there are poems that make reference to the writing process, and specifically, there are poems that make reference to the writing process. There are poems that make reference to the writing life,
Hmm.
and then there are Ars Poetica, right? Ars
Hmm.
Poetica, poems that are
Yep.
that are a state that they are about the art of poetry,
Hmm.
and then there are poems that use epigraphs or other explicit references to other
Hmm.
poems.
Yeah.
Are those the four main? I'm trying to think if I'm missing one.
Yeah. I think that's a good summary.
So then we should look at, and I do want to get to your reality poetry chart, which I'm fascinated by. I have lots of thoughts. But we should read through your list of. In fairness to you, you do call them guidelines, although you immediately reframe them as rules in the parentheses in your apology, in sort of saying like, don't take these too seriously. They're exceptions, but then they do. I think everybody after that refers to them as the rules,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. I
yeah.
probably shouldn't have used the word rules at all there, but
Yeah. But yeah, would you read through these these five, is it five? Five
Sure.
rules. Yeah.
So each poet may publish one Ars Poetica lyric poem in his or her career. There are no restrictions on prose essays and books, verse essays and epistles, etc. So the main point there was to try and say that I feel like short Ars Poetica lyric poems are things that get done a lot, and that really the impulse behind that probably would be better served by doing more critical writing, prose writing, things, in other formats would maybe be better for some of that impulse.
Yeah, I almost
Um,
want to answer with like a Tristram Saunders rule that like for every lyric ars poetica you write, you have to write a manifesto.
that maybe that would be a better one because I mean, to say you can write one in your career is very strict. My sense, the
I've
idea
already
behind
broken the
that
rule.
is
I've already broken
which
the rule. Yeah.
the idea behind that was more that on this one particular topic, is it really possible that one poet could write several excellent ones? And maybe they can, but I think I was going more for what I feel like the average ought to be, as opposed to what
Yeah.
every single person ought to do.
Although it's
Um,
also like like for me, I was gonna say it's like the Chinese like one child policy. Where like, well, but if your child dies, you can have another. Like my like,
so if
I
you
have
write
an
one
Ars
that's
Poetica in
but it's
both of my
bad, you,
books, but like by the time I wrote my second one, I thought my first one was a piece of shit. So,
that's
like, what are you gonna
yeah,
do? Maybe I'll feel that
that's
way about the
fair.
second one soon enough. But sorry. So yeah, the
Yeah.
first rule was
All
one
right.
Ars Poetica, one lyric Ars Poetica per life per career. Yeah,
That's probably
severe.
the
Yeah,
most severe. For
yeah.
each published collection, a poet can publish at most one poem that explicitly mentions the act of reading or writing poems.
Okay.
Maybe also too severe. Okay. If I think about actually offering these to individual people as something that they should follow, it doesn't feel right. But if I think what I was trying to express is if this is how most people were operating in their writing, it would alleviate the uh, overload from my perspective of that particular style of writing.
And this is and this is specifically poems that talk about the writing process or they talk about
Yeah,
the writing process specifically.
explicitly
Yeah, yeah,
mentions the act of reading or writing
yeah,
poems.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay, that's two. Number
Yep.
three.
Three, any poem that specifically concerns writing or poetry should offer something valuable to readers who are neither writers nor immersed in a literary lifestyle, or should be clearly framed as an address to fellow poets, critics, academics, etc., acknowledging the poem's limited scope. That's probably the least.
Yeah,
I still feel pretty good about that one.
yeah. Is that?
I'm saying that if the poem
Oh,
talks
right,
about
right.
writing,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
should offer something to readers who aren't writers, or it should be sort of framed as an address to who it is really talking to.
So if you, the poet, think this is really just for other writers,
Yeah,
then you should say so.
in some way. I mean, it
Yeah,
can be some kind of subtle thing in the title or subtitle or the way you publish it. I don't know,
yeah.
but
Though that's, I mean, that again, that seems
yeah,
like the other risk there is that that's a case where you're actually literally excluding a reader, right? You're saying like this is not for you. Like and maybe
that's
your argument
true.
is like these poems
Yeah,
are already not for them, so give
yeah.
them fair warning.
That's a valid point. Is that maybe there are readers who aren't writers who might find something valuable that you can't necessarily tell that up front, but you still feel like it's something worth offering. So
Yeah, yeah,
we're covering all the exceptions
yeah, yeah.
to
Of
these.
course.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
All right.
I have a philosophical defense of severe rules after we get to the end of this. But yeah.
Okay.
So that's number three. Number four.
Number four, any line or lines of poetry quoted as an epigraph should enhance the poem and should be subservient to the poem, not vice versa. Also,
Okay.
I think probably not controversial.
Yeah, I think that maybe like you're either not violating that rule. Well, even let's just say even if you are violating that rule, you don't think you are, right? Like, does anybody
That's
knowingly
true.
violate that rule?
I hope not.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess some people sort of
Yeah.
lightly will add an epigraph. I mean, there's like my epigraph rule is like one general epigraph per book.
Okay.
Because
Yeah.
I get frustrated when I see like stacks of epigraphs, and there are exceptions, of
Yeah.
course. I think the Secret History has two, and they're both pretty fucking good. But yeah, for the most part, I think like don't give me a page full of epigraphs.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. So, and I was referring here to epigraphs of individual poems.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Which
Okay.
is yeah, but yeah, it can also it can sort of create it
Yeah.
can create baggage,
Yeah.
and it can also. I mean, I know definitely the feeling I had reading Eliot as a kid was like, these are this is in Latin, this is in like how do
Yeah.
I, this is
Yeah.
in Italian. How
Yeah.
do I read this shit?
Yeah. And I think this is it's probably the most that's another very good example is to mention is Eliot because he's extremely elusive,
Oh man,
extremely dense, extremely difficult. But I did it's in a way, and it's the sort of intrigue and power of the language and the sort of really big universal type of topics he's going for can still, even if you have no clue what's going on, like I didn't when I was in high school, I still
yeah,
was very fascinated by the Wasteland and wanted to read it. And even though I didn't have a clue what was going on there, just because it was,
yeah.
um, I don't know, it was, it's there. There can be a lot of gray areas there
Yeah, I mean,
on,
and that I think that experience is, if not universal, very common. It certainly was my experience. It was
yeah,
Robert Penn Warren famously like was like, I love this, even if I'm not sure what it is.
yeah, yep,
So yeah, I think that's
yeah,
a very common encounter with
yeah.
very good poetry. All right, so
Yeah.
that's
So
four.
four
What's
four
number?
and five
Yeah,
really kind of go together. Five is about after poems.
yeah. These are poems that are
Where
labeled, title
yeah,
of poem after Ocean Vuong usually, or somebody like,
yeah. But it really, in both cases, it was. I said they should be used also used sparingly no more than once per collection and should vindicate their existence as original poems rather than personal expressions of admiration.
yeah,
And in both cases, it was to say that if there's a certain line or a certain idea or style that you really like, that maybe writing a poem that comes out of that is not the the best or the automatic way you should engage with it. There's other ways too that you might write something else or just use it as an inspiration, but not necessarily quote it directly and try to build on it in that way.
yeah. The
Which and there's always cases for that. I think those all of those modes are fine. I just think that it's to me that seems to be done a lot now.
Yeah, and it's funny the parenthetical conclusion to this rule I thought in a way was also sort of a secondary general thesis for the whole essay, which you say poets who admire a particular poet or poem would in many instances be better served by writing critical prose. And
Hmm.
that maybe like one of the like the quiet themes of the essay is like it's almost like class versus race arguments about public policy where you feel like how many of these problems would be solved if there were just fewer
Hmm.
if we published fewer bad poems,
Yeah.
like some of it is
Yeah.
like, well, maybe you don't need to be writing poems, maybe what you really need to
Yeah.
be writing is criticism, and at least try to write criticism if you like, because it
Hmm.
turns out it's pretty hard to write good
Yeah.
criticism, and it's usually illuminating when if
Hmm.
you have a snarky poetry opinion that is making it into your poem, get give a try at a critical essay,
Yeah.
see how it turns out.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so like when I read this, and then of course a lot of people had responses, and the strongest responses were either people just generally saying, "Yes, finally somebody's saying the thing I have felt and been annoyed by," and then the negative responses that were strongest tended to be attacks on these specific rules,
Hmm.
and I think like specific attacks on specific rules are sort of valid or not tend to be a little less interesting to me, because I'm kind of interested in, well, what can we learn from this? And what I
Hmm.
think like an advantage that severe rules have, particularly if they are not like
Not
not
enforced.
enforceable, right? Like I was going to say
Yeah.
like, some people will make the same argument for like Old Testament laws about stoning girls to death, if they pick up a piece of wood, and you're like,
Hmm.
I don't know, I'm like. Like if it does take away the enforcement, and I think a benefit is that as offended as you might be by one of these rules, provided you're not totally disheartened and totally spirit broken by the essay,
Hmm.
what will definitely happen is that it will at least give you pause the next time you're writing a poem like this, right? It may
That
not stop you. You may
yes.
not obey the rules, but it will at
Yeah.
least
Yeah.
be a thought in the back of your head when
Yeah.
you're stacking up Ars Poetica number 5, and you're like,
Yeah. And I feel like more than anything, that was really the biggest goal that I wanted to accomplish was just to say that that we should all recognize this tendency as what it is and not just think this is what poetry is. This is just normal poetry is to write about the life of a poet,
yeah,
which I feel like if you don't get the right perspective on it, you can read a lot of stuff that's out there and get this idea that, well, that's just what poems are about.
Yeah.
I mean,
And it is what a lot of
that's one
really good
thing
poems are
poems can be
about.
about, but
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
a lot of other things they can be about, and I think there's value if they're about more variety of things.
Because there's another version of a like a polemic or a rule based kind of essay that is it's honestly the way I think about really good writing prompts. The really good writing prompts tend to be, in a way, a temporary rule, saying
Yeah.
like,
Hmm.
"Hey, for the time being, don't do the thing you usually are able to. Like, don't reach for this tool you use all the time.
Hmm.
Tie this hand behind your back.
Hmm.
Make sure you include this thing you're not used to including."
Hmm.
And it's not, nobody is offended by a prompt. Well, I hope nobody's offended by a prompt. But in a way, I find that lists of rules like this are most useful for me as a writer, kind of as like it's sort of I add them to my tool belt of prompts, basically, of like
Hmm.
ways I can think about how I'm approaching a poem.
Hmm.
Like maybe it
Yeah.
would be useful here. Maybe lately I've written a lot about this. Maybe I've done a lot of poems that have this particular
Hmm. Yeah.
structure, pattern, or angle, and it would be good for me to try something else, freshen up the air a little
Hmm.
bit.
And one more
Please,
point I'll make on
please,
this
please. Yeah.
about the list is, and another thing that a few people mentioned was, what about illusion? Because I don't
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
specifically
yeah.
mention that, but and probably should have been more clear. I tried to with in the later part and with the last diagram, tried to make it clear that I think understanding and engaging with the tradition is a good thing and should inform your writing. It just doesn't necessarily need to be directly in the content. It can be, and someone made a helpful comment that I hadn't really thought about, which was that if you're writing in form, then writing in form is a way of engaging with the tradition, whether
Mhm.
you're using a received form or
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
copying the form of some poet you admire, but it's not something that is obvious from reading the poem itself. It's something you can recognize if you know that and you're part of that. But
Yeah,
it's it's a more oblique way of
yeah.
engaging with the broader community of writers.
Yeah, I mean, and there are a lot of poems that if you are well informed, you recognize that they are, whether it's with the form or whether it's a particular language or
Yeah,
whether it's the subject matter, they are
yeah.
clearly calling back something. But there's a difference between doing that in a way that signposts it at the beginning. And I guess like the risk is that if you make a point of identifying it at the beginning, you you could put off somebody who's not familiar.
Yeah. And
The yeah.
like we were like I was saying before about Eliot, I think even if your illusion is completely lost on me because I can't read Greek,
Right.
it's still there can be a way that the poem as a whole is still engaging. Ideally, I would prefer if the illusions are almost invisible to someone
Right,
unless
right.
they know it, and then they can enjoy that as well.
Yeah.
That's how I think about it, at least for myself. But
I
yeah.
mean, because the other question that comes to mind is the spectrum of translation, right? Because like one of the
Hmm.
poems on my list of like at Dover Beach, when I have fears that I may cease to be, when I consider how my light is spent, Sonnet 18, whoso list a hunt, on my first son, shield of Achilles, Adam's curse, there is a gold light in certain old paintings, an ode on solitude. And whoso list a hunt, nowhere is in hind, the Thomas Wyatt sonnet, one of my very favorite poems.
Hmm.
It is a version, it is an adapted version of a Petrarch sonnet. It does a lot of new stuff with it, but it is
Hmm.
clearly modeled on a Petrarch sonnet. And there that sort of exists somewhere along a spectrum of translation between something that is merely distantly informed by to something that is a denotative word for word
Hmm.
translation to something that just sort of imitates the sound. And
Hmm.
it seems to me that there's that the farthest end of that, the kind of the scholarly service to the world translation, is something none of us we could never say that that makes poetry less accessible, but
Hmm.
maybe there is a place on that spectrum where it starts to run afoul of some of your instincts. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, like I said, a lot of this was me trying to kind of flesh out what I wish I would see out there, but not but I think there's always a lot of exceptions, and there's always a lot of different perspectives, different ways you could see it. And you mentioned when I consider how my light is spent,
Yeah.
as another example, which is a good one and a poem that I love, but that's again to me one where the fact that he's the fact that he is a writer and is talking about something related to that is sort of very, very marginal to the poem. You almost don't even need to know that ex you, just that he's
Oh yeah,
lost
yeah,
the
because
ability
yeah,
ability
losing
to do something.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And what
losing
does
his
this
sight.
mean for
Yeah,
my
yeah,
sense as a person? The fact that he is a writer, of course, you know it's Milton. You know that he was blind and he was,
yeah,
losing this critical faculty. But it's the point of the poem is not really about that specifically. It's more just about what is a human's
yeah.
existence about. But
Though I mean, though then on the other hand, when I have
I'm
yeah,
sure you definitely have a lot of good counterexamples of great poems that do
yeah,
break
yeah,
these
yeah, yeah.
guidelines. I don't deny that at all.
Well, no, I mean, what again? I part of the reason I like provocations is that they force a was it Nietzsche who talks about a revaluation of values. They force me to at least like
Hmm.
ask questions, and it's funny
Yeah.
because like
Yep.
in my last book, I have a number of poems that are they started as loose translations and they are basically imitations that have a
Hmm.
lot of the shape and a lot of the stuff.
Hmm.
And if you are even remotely familiar with any of that, you will recognize them. But I went back and forth about how to mark them. And I finally
Hmm.
took, you initially had like after Horace, after Catullus, and I took those out
Hmm.
because I didn't want to discourage people. I mean, honestly, it's partly because when I'm reading a book of like a collection of poetry,
Hmm.
I am instantly less interested when I see that something is a translation. Mostly because most translations are
Hmm.
bad, and
Hmm.
because I kind of want to see like what you can do with your language. And so I
Hmm.
didn't want to
Yeah.
discourage people in that way. And then in the chapbook I'm about to put out, I did the other thing. I did it almost the other way around, where I have poems that are not at all translations, but they are heavily influenced and inspired by a poem by Leopardi, and then the Seafarer, the anonymous,
Hmm.
Middle English poem.
Hmm.
And in both of those cases, what I settled on was there. Again, the title and the poem. If you know the original, you will recognize them. But my thought was actually, if you don't know the original, if you're not well informed, if you're like
Hmm.
somebody in my family who's
Yeah.
smart and literate but not deeply informed about poetry, I want you to know that there is a poem that that like I want to in a way like I want to
Yeah.
show you a thing you can discover that's really great.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I ended up
That's
just including I didn't say after I just included epigraphs to each of those,
hmm.
but I bet I could
Yeah.
easily see why those would be they could put you off as well.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, yeah, that's a really good point, and I can see why you would go either way with that,
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah. And I don't I don't I'm not confident. Yeah,
you want the poem to be good on its own,
totally,
even
totally.
if
Yeah,
someone has no clue where it's from.
yeah,
But then, do you want to offer a reader who doesn't recognize the source where to find it? And in general, I would think that's good to have. Do you put it in the poem, or do you put it somewhere separately? Then you have to really dig to find it if it's, in an acknowledgement or something.
yeah,
But
yeah.
the as a if you as a reader coming if you come across an epigraph or an introduction that mentions a writer or a poem that you have is totally unfamiliar to you, that could be something you automatically say, oh, I'm not going to get this, I'm not going to be interested in this. But if
Definitely.
it's
Yeah,
but if it is, you know if it starts in a way that kind of draws you in and is good on its own, then hopefully it would do what you said, and pull someone to actually learn about and engage with the source material too. So
yeah,
and all of those I feel like I feel like that's an approach that's more in line with what I was getting at later, which was to say that being well versed and immersed in the tradition and being inspired by other writers and other interactions with art are good things. It just that I don't want the poem to be about, I read a book that I loved and I'm
yeah, yeah,
writing a
yeah,
poem
yeah,
about that,
yeah.
which is not really what you're describing.
No, but and that it is why I also find like in your list of things that irk you the most, in a way, like the most offensive, although it is also the case with some poems I like a lot, the most offensive in a way, or the most likely to offend is Right. It's like honestly, it's not even writing about the writing life or about writing itself. It's about it's writing about like MFA programs, like
Yes,
writing about like
that's
very very
yeah,
cloistered little
yeah,
tiny special writing
yeah,
communities. Like that's
yeah.
it's not that you can't write it. Like in fact, I don't think it's a great poem, but I quite like Decorum, the Stephen Dunn poem about a writing workshop. But like it's
Yeah.
it's the definitely an exception that proves the rule.
Yeah, I should mention when we're saying this that there was one commenter made a comment that I would have been a better data point even to put in the piece if I had had this kind of detailed analysis on hand, which I didn't.
Yeah, yeah,
But this guy Frank Dent said, I once went through and classified the poems in Best American Poetry volume according to various criteria, and counted 15 poems, 20%, that referenced or talked about poetry, poets, the writing of poetry, the teaching of poetry, and poetry adjacent subjects such as faculty parties.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. And
so
that's
that
like,
20%,
yeah,
that seems
yeah,
way
yeah,
too
yeah.
high to me.
And I hope what he mean again. I hope he's not conflating in there again like an epigraph from another poem versus like at
No, I
at
did.
the at the
Yeah, that's
creative
true.
writing department faculty party because the
Yeah,
latter is so much more likely to be obnoxious.
yeah, yeah. I did not vet this fact, but
Yeah, yeah,
it didn't seem outlandish, so I took it at face value. But
yeah. I mean, because there's like another implicit rule that I feel like it should so much go without saying, and it really doesn't among writers, not just poets, but I talked to my fiction students about this as well. Like you, you should be writing to your own delight. Like you
yes,
should, as if should be able to imagine yourself as a stranger stumbling upon this, having no reason to keep reading, but being driven to keep reading by how engrossing it is. And in a
hmm
way, like your essay is a kind of a is a caveat to that, saying like, except also take into account the fact that
your
like
own.
you're in this specific
Yeah,
milieu and the
yes,
stranger version of you might not be.
yes. Maybe like a past version of yourself or an
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
alternate universe
Right.
version of
Parallel
yourself.
universe you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ethan McGuire made another comment that I thought was helpful, asking about, what do you think about other cultures where there's very different literary traditions, like, he mentioned Tang and Song China, Edo
Hmm.
Japan, where there's a lot of sort of public discourse between poets, and that's, part of the literary tradition, and it's still a popular art form that people like, which I think is very true. And what it made me think of was the hip hop today,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
because there's a lot of hip hop that's about how good a rapper you are and
Yeah,
who
yeah.
you're putting down,
I mean,
and a lot of this sort of
the most exciting exchange of the last couple of years was the Drake Kendrick feud,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um,
And but I feel like the key difference there is that the audience for hip hop is really large and really broad, and people like that performative aspect of it. Whereas I feel like when poets are writing about their world, people don't even know about that world, and so they're not going to
yeah,
be as engaged by that kind of thing. And also, like I said before about formal poetry, is that when hip hop is also music with rhythm and beat and these other
yeah.
aspects. It's not just the words, as
Yeah,
opposed to
yeah,
a free verse poem where there's the only thing there is the words for you to read. So
yeah, yeah,
there's
yeah.
more levels of interest to it as well.
Like if I'm finishing the Ernest Becker book, it's taken me forever to read The Denial of Death, and part of me feels like that like one of the sub theses of that book is, hey, you might not be quite as mature and well adjusted as you think you are. And part of this like one of the theses of this book essay seemed to me to be like addressing certain kinds of poets and saying like, hey, you might not be as charming as you think you are. This stuff you're writing might not be as enchanting and delightful as you seem to assume it is.
I mean, yeah, like I said before, from where I was myself several years back in the past, and a lot of the people that I still interact with, they're just the idea that people are writing poems is almost a foreign
Yeah,
idea
yeah,
to
yeah.
them. So like it's if your poem is predicated on people knowing about poets and what they do, that's kind of a hard leap to make.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's again not to say that no one should write poems that are for other poets that other poets would enjoy, but just that to sort of call attention to and point out the fact that hey, there's this big gulf between where a lot of people are and where poets are writing, and that
Yeah, yeah.
we should remember that and at least take that into consideration.
And to return to Alice's essay, I think like the hope with an essay like this, and you never, like you never know exactly how your writing is going to affect others, and you probably can't ever entirely avoid rubbing somebody the wrong way. But maybe like the hope would be that a healthy way to take this essay would be not to say this is another way to feel shitty about yourself, but rather this is another
Yeah,
way. This is another question you can ask when you are applying your critical mind to your own work.
yeah, yeah. And I certainly would not want to. The intent was not to discourage anyone, but it was more just to make people think and kind of raise awareness about mainly, like I said, that from when you're inside this space, it can be easy to not realize how alienating that is to other people.
Yeah,
And maybe not to everyone, but at least to some people.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I really appreciated the comment that Elijah made.
What was I didn't I don't know if I saw his.
He said he said this was is doing the Lord's work, helping us extricate ourselves from our miasmatic echo chamber.
Oh yeah,
But then,
yeah.
then he said, "This is what I liked. Poetry is not something poets do to amuse or flatter themselves. Poetry is a gift the poet offers to all humankind that we may better delight in reality." And
So this,
I
yeah,
think that's really what I ultimately is trying to say is that the point of poetry should be to point you out towards life and the world in some way.
and this is the thing that I have least figured out, but am in a way most interested in here is you have a series of flowcharts.
Yes.
The first one is just it says reality, and then there are three arrows pointing to a box, and then out of the box is one arrow that's followed by the word poetry. So reality, much reality goes in, a little bit of poetry comes out. It's sort of like a lot of grass goes in and a little bit of
Yep.
milk into the cow and a little bit of milk comes out of the cow, kind of.
Sure. Yeah.
And as I was gonna say, as with poetry, maybe we don't want like chickens being fed ground up chicken. It's probably not a good plan. But then you have a series of other flowcharts where like
Yeah.
if part of your reality, as is likely to happen if you're a poet,
Hmm.
if part of your
Yep.
reality, if one of those entry arrows becomes poetry stuff,
Yes.
then that goes back in to the chamber.
Yep.
And then increasingly more and more of those arrows that are coming out of poetry go back in until you have a poetic human centipede of one,
Yes.
where there's no reality in all poetry.
Yeah.
And I thought like it was funny. My feeling reading those was kind of again it was split because I definitely recognized that as a useful like challenge to myself when I'm in my own kind of writing work and process and thinking about what I want to be working on and like well
Hmm.
I don't want to get too like I don't want to just write poems the AWP conference though. God help me, I did write some poems about the AWP conference in my chapbook. Although, in fairness to me, none of the people in it actually make it to the conference. Uh, but but then the other thought I had was that I think there are two just honestly and validly different approaches to this question. And I think Elijah is very much, I think, on like of this model in the way that you are. And even like I was reading Paul Pastor's poetry that since he's graduated from University of Houston,
Hmm.
and I thought of it. It was funny. I mean, not surprisingly, because he's one of the he's the mafia don of the place. It reminded me of some of James Matthew Wilson's poems. That
Hmm.
there is a sense of like there's a great deal of craft and refinement, and there has been experience and life and reading, but also a lot of encounter with the world directly that
Hmm.
goes into the poem.
Hmm.
And then there is sort of poetry that emerges or into the writing process, and then poetry emerges out of that.
Hmm.
And I think that's true for all of us to some extent, right? Clearly,
Yeah.
we bring in our memories, we bring in our experiences, but it also it I think there's a genuinely different process because one of the things I've kind of marveled in contrasting with Elijah before is that he does come into a poem knowing what he wants to say. And then the work of the poem is figuring out the best way to say it. And he puts
Hmm.
an enormous amount
Hmm.
of work into that.
Yeah.
Um,
See, it's
yeah.
interesting because that's actually not the way that that's usually not the way I write poems.
Yeah.
Is I don't necessarily know what I'm going to say. Sometimes I do, but a lot of times I don't. But I feel like at least the times when it feels the most natural and successful to me is that there's been some external experience that's kind of becoming forming something new and maybe drawing multiple connections together, different images, different experiences in a way that um, hopefully can tie into something cohesive. But it's not necessarily that I'm have in mind a goal and pulling it all together as much as that it's coming from that some lived experience, sensory or relational or experiential.
Yeah. The way I think about it is partly because I don't. I mean, I so seldom come in with an idea. You mentioned a poem that you said like, it was guilty of some of these breaking some of these rules, but the redemption you found in it is a poem of mine called "Overheard at a Reading" that ends with a kind of a call to quit politics, pick up a cigarette, delete your timeline, fall in fucking love. And you said it was redeemed by kind of turning away from the poetry world out to the grass touching world. And it's funny because to me, that's sort of I'm fine, I'm happy with it. But like the real failure of that as a poem is that it is too much rhetoric. It is too much saying a thing that it knows it is saying.
I mean, it is literally giving commands.
Yeah,
So yeah,
totally, totally. Yeah. And I mean,
which that can be a poetic mode, but it's
yeah,
one that,
I
yeah,
think it's limited. I think
mhm,
it's limited.
yeah,
But for the most part, I think of writing not as being. It's not so much that like reality goes in and poetry comes out, but that so much of it is about testing whether the line or the sound or the sentence that's beginning to come together is true, and whether I can catch a wind, whether I can get any momentum with it, and then there's a sort of a recursive process of like, is this bullshit? Is this interesting? Does that sound decent? And
hmm,
so for me, it's almost more like air passing through a woodwind, and the woodwind is itself continually shaped and refined by the process of reading and writing poetry. So that
yeah,
it's sort of
yeah.
it's hard to say like, well, there's not poetry going in. Like poetry is the thing happening in a way. I don't know.
Well, so I think that's where the diagrams as a whole, let me just say,
Sure.
they were, I felt like they were useful to try and start the conversation and
Yeah.
illustrate the
Of
point.
course.
But the more
Yeah.
the more I thought about them in detail, there's all kinds of ways you say, well, what does this mean, and how do you fit this into the equation? And it's very oversimplified. It's very much just for illustration
Yeah. Of
purposes.
course. Of course. Yeah.
But that is why I put the last one. I had one more at the end, which is where the output of poetry is a dotted line that's coming into the side of the box. And so
That may not have
that
come
in
into my. I think that may not have printed out with my. Maybe I saw that originally, but it didn't print out
so
when I
the so
printed it.
the
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
main inputs are still reality of your lived experience, and then as a side input, dashed input, the fact that you're
Oh
reading
yeah.
and
Yeah.
experiencing poetry is kind of, that's the sort of refining process of knowing what works and what doesn't, and thinking about how it sounds and what kind of forms you're using, or which writers you're being influenced by or echoing. That's a part of it, but it's not necessarily the what the poem's about or the content of the poem. And that's the
Yeah.
one of the distinctions I was trying to make, is that this it can work this way, and to me, this is a way that keeps keeps it more open to people who are not part of the poetry experience specifically.
Yeah. But it also acknowledges how much the process of writing. I mean, even if we're not doing
Oh,
it the
it,
way
it
that Tang
absolutely
poets
it
do,
informs it.
like,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, like that we may not have the same kind of formal rules for how to quote other poets within our poems,
Hmm.
but we are constantly, our internal, verbal landscape is constantly shaped by all of the things we've read. So you
Yeah,
can't avoid that being part
for
of the
sure.
instrument.
For
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. If I were to like do a dumb guy diplomatic simplification of some of this essay, maybe I would say like, think hard before you publish a poem about a writing workshop or a writing program.
Yeah.
Think hard before you title a poem Ars Poetica, and if you write a lot of poetry, try writing criticism.
Th those are, yeah, those are all, I think, good ways of saying the main ideas of what I was trying to get
Yeah,
across,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
maybe in less confusing ways.
Well, no, but again, I like the provocation, partly because I have a healthy fuck you reflex, so I don't. It's not gonna, it's not gonna wound me. But yeah, like this essay gave me some new tools and questions and processes to turn around as I'm approaching my own work, which I'm grateful for.
Yeah. I appreciated hearing from you and from some other people who didn't agree with all of it, but wanted to talk about it and had, some good discussion about it. So
Yeah, and I mean, and I love this kind of essay. Like, I'm very excited for this kind of essay to exist, for people to be writing it, for new verse review to be putting them out. I'm curious for you. Are you? I don't know what the sort of what you have already been thinking about, or what has been prompted by any of this, but I guess sort of like the two follow up questions I have about this essay as a whole are, on the one hand, are there any do you have any other provocations cooking? Are there any other like pet peeves that are particularly eating away at you? For one,
no,
no. Okay,
no,
good. All right. This is
nothing
it.
else.
Nothing
I
else
mean,
annoys you. This is
nothing else in the near term, I would say.
good,
I
good,
haven't
good.
had anything else in mind. This honestly, this came about because I was just having an email conversation with another poet a friend that I talk with, and this point kind of came up, and I started to express some things about it, and got fired up about it, and he said you should write an essay about it, so then I
Yeah.
did.
No, no. I'm
Yeah.
yeah. I'm glad you did. And then the second one is, if you were to write a if gun to your head, you have to write a manifesto demanding that a certain kind of poetry be written, what might that be? What is the poetry you most want to see written that's not
Mm.
being written as enough of?
Hmm.
Or
Well,
a thing you would like people to
yeah,
do with their poem. Like if they're
yeah,
taking one thing away, what's a thing they might
yeah.
add or consider?
Like I said here, I feel like um, for me the best poetry is sounds beautiful and is engaging to listen to, is about really big topics, whether human relationships, spirituality, the world, kind of the universal kind of topics, which all poetry can't be, but I think those are tend to be the most memorable, or my favorite poems.
Mhm.
And then things that are very I think maybe this sort of idea of reality being the input has to do with, common or shared experiences, sensory experiences, what you can see and feel and hear in the world around you. And you can do all of that in a poem that's about writing poetry too. So it's not aside from the fact that a topic that's something very universal, but every
Mhm.
poem can't be like that. And I don't I think that's not necessarily the aspiration, is to make all of your poems about love and death. Like we were saying,
Sure,
it's
yeah, yeah.
that then becomes too limiting. But that is, I think, the highest place that poetry can go to talk about the most enduring human concerns.
Because yeah, I think of like a divide that most thoughtful readers and writers of poetry care about lots of dimensions of it and not just one. But
Yeah.
I do, if it if it doesn't at all sound good, if it's not at all memorable, and especially if it doesn't at all ring emotionally true, then
Mhm.
it's going to be really hard for me to connect with it. And I think about, like,
Yeah.
it's different because this is in a way, it's a narrower but also more, for him, universal concern. I think about like the way in which almost everything Cameron reads is alien to him in certain respects.
Mm.
But he also, the thing that is the great link and the great emphasis for him is that it's made of language, and that
Yeah.
that is truly, like, that's the thing that's number one on his list, right? It's
Mhm.
got to have, like, the language has to be notably something,
Yeah.
and then everything else might matter, but it matters after that.
Yeah. And I think that, for honestly, for me, I do think probably the sound
Mm.
is probably number one.
Yeah.
The first poem I ever loved when I was 5 years old was Jabberwocky
Oh, good
by
Lord.
Lewis
Yeah.
Carroll.
Yeah.
It's literally nonsense, but it's
Yeah.
I was said it all the time, and
Yeah, yeah.
set me on a journey of loving to read other stuff. So
It's given us. I know it gave us chortle and galumphing. Because I know it's like I want to say there's at least one other word in there that
yeah,
that it
chortle's the
coined.
chortle's the most famous. I'm trying to,
But yeah, I mean, and that sounds just as good today as it did when you were five.
yeah.
Like, um,
'Twas brillig in the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe. Beware the jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the jub bird, and shun the frumious bandersnatch.
well done, Lewis Carroll. But yeah, sound good if nothing else. Be enchanting. Be
Yeah.
that seems
And
fair.
then if it's also about something that's very, relatable, meaningful, universal, that's really the best you can do is if it sounds great and it has some really significant meaning.
Yeah.
It's something that I want to have in my head.
There's a part of me that wonders if like universality is because I think you're I'm with you and like you're kidding yourself if you think that that's not part of great literature. Like if you think that the
Yeah.
universality that we recognize something across boundaries of all kinds, if you think that's not part of literature, you're kidding yourself.
Yeah.
But I almost wonder if it's not a little bit like sort of the moral improvement that perhaps theoretically can come through poetry, which is to say, its presence may not be heavily correlated to the intention to include it, right? Like
Yeah.
the things that are often very
And
universal are not
yeah.
necessarily that you were sitting down writing like this is going to be really universal.
Yeah,
Everybody's going to connect with
absolutely.
this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. It's usually something very specific,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
maybe even something that seems too
Right.
specific,
You're
but
like, oh, I
it's something
recognize that
that,
totally weird character. Like
yeah,
I knew somebody like that once.
yeah, yeah. So the thing that, yeah, it's you can't necessarily try for it very directly, but it's if you're, I think again, yes, if you're informed by and aware of reality, then that will show itself. It's not,
And you have to check against your own. I mean, that's something I do wish people would do more in writing of all kinds is just stop and look at what they've written and ask themselves, like, does that ring true to me? Do I think that's a truthful
yeah,
account, whether it's magical, fictional, whatever? Like, does
yeah,
that do like, or can I see my own puppet strings?
yeah,
Which I feel like
yeah.
it's a question people seem not to
Mm.
ask enough.
Well, it can be a hard question to ask because
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
we have
yeah,
our own
yeah,
we
yeah.
have blinders to ourselves. So
No, this is true. Speaking of which, I know you've been like a very thoughtful listener and critic. Are there things that have been particularly bugging you, or you've wanted to jump in and shout about on the show?
I mean,
You seem like you're not a
there's
big jumper in and shouter, but
yeah, I generally am not don't like being provocative, but somehow I put this out there. Although again, I think I did a lot of couching on things aside from
sure.
the guidelines, but nothing immediately jumps to mind. I mean, I enjoy hearing the things you talk about, and sometimes I like them and agree with them, and sometimes I don't. But
Is there something you wish would happen on the show? Like we do a lot of different kinds of episodes, and there are different people who come on and have different perspectives. Like, is there something you would like to hear more of, or hear that seems like it could be part of the show that's not?
it's a good question. It's not something I've
Yeah,
thought about at all.
yeah, yeah, sure, sure, sure.
Um,
Yeah,
but I can think about that and
yeah,
let you
no,
know if
yeah,
anything comes to mind.
yeah, yeah. You and anybody listening, yeah,
Yeah.
uh,
Nothing jumps to mind when you ask that right away, but I'm sure I could think of something after a
yeah.
little time to reflect.
No, I mean, yeah, I'm always eager to hear from people who might have just been thinking about things from a different angle and have
Hmm.
it's like it's a feeling I always think about doing when I was doing theater is like you don't want somebody to be sitting in the audience like screaming to themselves, why doesn't he like why don't they acknowledge this?
Yeah.
Why is everybody ignoring X?
Yes. It's, something that did just come to mind about that I was when you did the episode of not too long ago about Joseph Massey.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I that was helpful for me because I'm kind of aware of him, but I didn't know the whole backstory of
Yeah, yeah.
everything that happened with him. I do kind of just brought generally, but not very specifically.
Sure.
Um, but when you were talking about bad poets and good poets, and you used the analogy too of the about chess players
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
your
yeah.
own chess rating. Like you're a good chess player. You're not a great chess player. That's what I would say to that. Like a
Okay.
bad chess player is going to have a, be below average. But
Yeah.
if you're above average, good. Like, but I think somehow making the distinction
Yeah,
between
yeah,
good
yeah,
and
yeah.
great
Right.
is because you know I don't.
Maybe the
I think
distinction for me
most
was like,
people
yeah.
publishing poetry are not necessarily bad poets. They're just maybe not great, and there's just so much okay,
Yeah,
average,
yeah, yeah,
decent
yeah.
poetry out there that it's hard to find the really good stuff. And
Yeah.
I think
And it
that's I think that's maybe or if that's elevated to getting praised as if it's the best thing ever, then there's a big disconnect there. But
maybe the distinction that I'm interested in is that if we're having a conversation publicly about poetry, then
yes,
it's sort of like there's the level is it's not
it should be
are
really
you
great.
above or
Yeah, yeah,
below average? It's
yeah.
is it good enough to be worth discussing publicly?
Yes, absolutely.
And I should say I
Which is why
just
I'm not sure why
yeah.
we're talking about this essay that I wrote.
Well, I mean, but I think like it's a well, I mean, and that's the other thing that's true, and with this is no comment on your poetry at all, but like in a way, a piece of criticism doesn't have to be as perfected as a poem does. Like
Mhm.
to be like
Yeah,
very useful and very helpful,
yeah,
a poem partly because it's so small, typically, is
yes.
you don't there's not a lot of
It
room
has to
for
be very
dicking
potent.
around.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and I should say that I got walloped today by a listener who in chess. So there's some other middling, mediocre, decent chess players out there who are definitely much better than I am. Some of whom listen to the show. So
Yeah.
do you play at all?
No.
No.
I've
That was my conversation with Stephen Searcy. Now, originally, we had planned, as I mentioned, we had planned to talk also with Katie Dozier about all of this. I am going to be getting Katie and Tim on the show, maybe separately, maybe eventually together as well down the road. They are extremely busy, as one is not surprised to hear. Stephen and I had also had a little bit of an exchange about last week's episode on Paul J. Pastor's The Christian Poetry Comeback. I was going to include a little note at the end of this episode, just going over some of the feedback I got, some from other people as well as some sort of more factual notes from Stephen about it. But I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole. Stephen recommended an essay that led me to another essay. So I'm just going to put all of that on The Secret Show. I think it is pretty interesting, both because it sort of digs into some of the deeper questions behind the essay about the poetry comeback. We get into a whole other essay by Dana Joy that I had not yet read about Catholic writing, and I think there's just sort of some like very worthwhile questions about Christian art. I think both Joya and Pastor make some good points and are very wrong as well in what they say. But I do think that there's some sort of like really worthwhile questions to ask. And I have some thoughts about what might be the beginnings of answers. So go check that out at sleeverickets.substack.com. Put your email address into the slot and you will get an email from me granting you a week's access free to the show. There's 180 episodes up there now and a new one every week. It's extremely cheap. I think I am going to be raising the subscription fee, so go ahead and sign up now. Lock that in. If you have some expendable income and you would like to do more to support the show, you can become a motherfucker of the arts and give a little extra every month. It makes a big difference. Or if you have a strong desire to listen to the show, but not quite the financial means to do so, then send me a note at sleeverickets@gmail.com, where you can also reach me with all of your complaints, demands, manifestos, and disquisitions. Thank you all for listening. With any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.